about Chapter 32, Section 2, and it's titled Watergate, Nixon's Downfall. And so we're going to learn about President Richard Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal, which forced him ultimately to resign from office. Now, the office of the President of the United States has changed historically. Several examples of this. During the time of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the office of presidency 4 times. 4 times. He also authorized an unprecedented spending plan to create jobs. And he also, of course, called for a draft that raised an army of 15 million people to fight the Nazis and the Japanese. And then his vice president, Harry Truman, also had to retain an awesome level of power during the Cold War. And so there are many examples in American history like this. You could think of the Civil War, you could think of the economic crises, you could even think of foreign events going on in Europe, like the Napoleonic Wars. But various crises have led the executive power to become the most powerful branch. And then we get to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon expanded the powers of the president in waging the war in Vietnam. He often ignored Congress on both domestic, economic, and foreign issues. He had a very small, loyal group of advisors. Like him, they desired absolute secrecy. These 3 men are H.R. Haldeman, the White House Chief of Staff, John Ehrlichman, the Chief Domestic Advisor, and John Mitchell, Nixon's former Attorney General. Now, the reason I mention these men's names is because all 3 are going to be complicit in felony-level corruption and will spend significant time in prison as a result of their actions. So what actually happened? So Nixon won in 1968 and became President of the United States. 4 years into his office, the Vietnam War was still happening. Congress was debating taking away the president's power to continue the war, which they ultimately did. And there were protest movements, and there was major divisiveness in the country. Nixon felt that he would not win re-election without some rather sneaky tactics. And so he authorized an attempt to break into the Democratic headquarters to find compromising information to use it to blackmail the Democratic Party. In fact, it's very similar to the charges that are being alleged against Russia, that Russia is finding compromising information about Democratic candidates to bolster the Republican candidate in the 2016 election. And so the Watergate scandal, as it was known, because it's the Watergate Hotel, it's actually within walking distance of the White House. And when we go on the White House tour, we'll pass by. Oh, yeah, there's, okay. Now, it was an attempt to break in, to destroy certain documents, and to, again, find compromising information. Now, these people were caught, and they were simply called the plumbers. And they endured their arrest, their conviction, their incarceration in silence. And meanwhile, like, people are wondering what happened. Is this an isolated event? Is this connected to anything? Who authorized this break-in? Well, they retained their silence. And so the investigation was going nowhere. until a reporter from the Washington Post continued the investigation, would not let it go, and managed to link the Nixon administration to the break-in. Now, the White House denied these allegations, claimed there's little public interest in these charges, there's bigger events going on, we need to focus on the national problems. And meanwhile, Nixon was elected by a landslide. So this went to trial. When a president is charged with a crime, it goes before a House Judiciary Committee. And the committee decides if it goes to trial. Well, it's gone to trial, so the Senate is investigating. The presiding judge was John Circa, and he felt that the burglars were not acting alone. The leader of these burglars was James McCord, was convicted of perjury, meaning he lied under oath. So he tried to lie about his involvement, about any connections with the administration, and it was proven that advisors were involved. Meanwhile, counsel to the White House, John Dean, was dismissed by the president. Other members of the administration resigned. Head of the investigative committee was Senator Sam Ervin. So, John Dean, this former counsel to the White House, gave his testimony that Nixon was involved in the cover-up. It's very much like the Manafort testimony, that he said that Trump was complicit in these charges of corruption. Well, so John Dean declared that Nixon was involved in the cover-up, that he was aware of the plumbers' attempts to break into the Democratic headquarters. In fact, another White House insider, Alexander Butterfield, said that Nixon kept tapes of all conversations going on in the Oval Office. He wanted to use them someday for his memoirs. And so there was evidence, as Butterfield claimed, that we could actually find out what Nixon had said, what he knew, what he authorized within the Oval Office. And so special prosecutor in the case, Archibald Cox, subpoenaed the tapes, meaning the court has now ordered the president to surrender these tapes, which may or may not incriminate him. Nixon ordered that the special prosecutor be fired. So he attempted to fire the person that was challenging him, that was leading his case. And the attorney, the Attorney General to the United States, Elliot Richardson, actually refused. And then, in what's now called the Saturday Night Massacre, Richardson, the Attorney General to the President of the United States, appointed and chosen by the President of the United States, has now refused an order of the President of the United States. And then he resigned, meaning the President made him resign, probably. The deputy, the Attorney General deputy who takes over if the Attorney General does resign or gets fired, also refused to fire Archibald Cox. And then he got fired. So Nixon was hell-bent on stopping this investigation by firing his chief prosecutor, then by firing his Attorney General, and then by firing the person who replaced the Attorney General. I mean, if there's ever a charge of an abuse of power, this is what we're seeing. So meanwhile, Archibald Cox was replaced. by Leon Jaworski. But at this point, the tapes are not going away. The public knows that there are tapes. The prosecution knows there are tapes. At this point, the Vice President of the United States resigned. His name is Spiro Agnew. He revealed that he had accepted bribes. He revealed that he was involved in the committee to re-elect the president, the group that had broken into the Watergate hotel. And so Nixon nominated Vice President Gerald Ford. Hold that thought because it's very important. Nixon nominated Gerald Ford. He is the only person to have ever served as President of the United States without going through an election. Remember that name, because we're going to come back to that.
The U.S. ping pong team met with President Nixon today at an Oval
And
Office
wouldn't you know
ceremony.
it, a few months later, they invited me and the ping pong team to visit the White House. So I went again, and I met the President of the United States again. Only this time, they didn't get us rooms in a real fancy hotel.
So are you enjoying yourself in our nation's capital, young man? Yes, sir. Well, where are you staying? It's called the Hotel Ebbot. Oh, no. I know of a much nicer hotel. It's brand new, very modern. I'll have my people take care of it for you.
Security, Frank Wells.
Yeah, sir. You might want to send a maintenance man over to that office across the way. The lights are off and they must be looking for a fuse box or something because them flashlights, they're keeping me awake. Thank you. Good night.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
It's really just that simple. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned the tapes. The tapes aren't going away. I mean, he tried to fire the prosecutor that ordered for the tapes. He tried to fire his replacement. He tried to fire the Attorney General to the United States. He's going to really scary lengths to stop this investigation. But in March of 1974, the grand jury has now indicted 7 of his aides with charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Felony level offenses for 7 of his aides. So finally, Nixon went on television and said, "I'm going to release edited versions of these transcripts. Some information will be redacted in the interest of national security." Sound familiar? Again, if you're news junkies and you followed this over the week, the Mueller investigation has now been released, but much of it has been redacted in the interest of national security. So, in summer of 1974, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled unanimously that Nixon had to surrender the tapes. Meanwhile, the House Judiciary Committee, which is the first group charged by the Constitution to investigate wrongdoings of a sitting president while in office, they approved 3 articles of impeachment. And these are formal accusation of wrongdoing while in office, through obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress. Each of these 3 would be grounds for impeachment, but he has committed all 3. Meanwhile, Nixon released the tapes. There are 18 minutes of those tapes that have been redacted that we don't know still to this day what they say. I'd love to know what's on those 18 minutes of tape. Because at this point the war's over, national security, there's no reason we shouldn't know what's on those tapes. But we still don't know what those 18 minutes were. But nonetheless, when he released the tapes, the rest of the information showed evidence of the administration's role in the attempt to blackmail the Democratic Party during the 72 election. And it also showed proof that the president had tried to cover this up. And so the House was about to vote on impeachment, and that's when Nixon resigned. So the effects of this, 25 members of his administration were convicted of felony charges and served time in prison. 25 members of the White House served time in prison, except for the President of the United States.
Over the next 2 years, Watergate became a titanic struggle between the White House and the press.
I don't respect the type of journalism, the shabby journalism that is being practiced.
The White House and Congress.
Republicans do not cover up. Republicans do not go ahead and commit illegal acts.
The White House and the public. And then, in the summer of 1973, the nation learned of the president's secret tapes.
I was aware of listening devices.
When the White House revealed there was an 18-and-a-half-minute gap on one of the Watergate tapes and demonstrated how the president's secretary, Rosemary Woods, might have erased it accidentally, there was an uproar.
Famous picture of Rose Woods, how you'd have to, what you'd have to do to go through to erase the tape and be on the phone or whatever. At the same time was, sort of like the 6-foot stretch.
It was called Rosemary's Boo Boo. The episode deeply wounded the president's credibility.
Made it all very dubious. It was the prelude to the smoking gun.
The fierce battle to force the president to hand over the tapes led to Watergate's endgame. When the president decided to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, rather than release the tapes, the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, resigned, and his deputy was sacked. It was called the Saturday Night Massacre.
The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history.
The Supreme Court would finally resolve the issue of the tapes. In the case of the United States versus Richard Nixon, they unanimously ordered the president to hand them over.
Nixon lost political power because he betrayed his office, and people realized that.
And when the contents of the tape showed that the president was involved in the cover-up since the first days after the break-in, it was the smoking gun that no one could defend. Richard Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
A president who ordered political espionage against his opponents was ultimately undone by the secret recordings he ordered of himself.
As we now know from the tapes, Nixon wanted to, in a sense, run the presidency as an instrument of his personal revenge.
And as those tapes have been released through the years, they have constructed a portrait of his presidency that Richard Nixon could hardly have intended.
He installed the taping system because he really was concerned about how he would look in history's eyes. So he wanted to have the raw materials to construct a heroic portrait of his presidency when it came time to write his memoirs.
And the piece of tape that some think says the most about the Nixon presidency is the one with nothing on it, the 18-and-a-half-minute gap. Who erased the tape and what was said? Some forensic audio experts believe they may soon have the answers.